Good afternoon, people here, and we're very glad that we can continue our series of Leuven Colloquia on Ancient Philosophy into our second year. And today we have a guest from Paris. So we're very glad to have her here, Charlotte Murgier, who did her PhD not so far from here, actually, in the University of Lille in 2009. And she's now connected to the University Paris-Sorbonne, where she also works at the CNRS, if I'm not mistaken. It was previously. I'm sorry. She's a lecturer at University Paris-Sorbonne. People may know her from her marvelous book, Éthique en dialogue, Aristote, lecteur de Platon, where she discusses Plato's and Aristotle's ethics and how Aristotle in his ethics is in dialogue, building on problems raised by Plato. She published various articles on topics related to this. And today as well, she will talk on a related topic, which fits very well the topic of the research project that is going on in Leuven, where we look at Aristotle's criticism of Plato or reports on Plato. And the title for the talk of today will be Principles of Practical Knowledge, Aristotle's Discussion with Plato. So please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation at this series of lecture. I am very honored by the presentation you just made. First, I would like to say a few introductory words about my methods in order to vindicate a little the choices I made. So it may sound a bit deceptive that I'm going to talk about ethics in a series of lectures about principles, but I apologize for not being a metaphysician, but most of all about Aristotle in a series about ancient Platonism. So, as Jan Sommer told in his presentation, my PhD is on Aristotle's interpretation of Plato, and rather not just criticism, but how he builds on Plato's dialogues and assumption. So in my PhD, I presented my method as a kind of midway between two readings. The majority view, more or less continuous with Jaeger, developmentalism, arguing that Aristotle's Platonism or Platonic aspects in Aristotle are only traces of his academic past. Aristotle's mature views break with Plato, and the more Aristotle becomes anti-Platonist, the more Aristotle is Aristotle. That's, for me, the majority view. The minority view, updated by Gerson, for instance, stands for concordance between Aristotle and Plato. And in this concordance view, in accordance with Middle and Neoplatonist approaches, and in this concordance view, Aristotle's philosophy is less opposite than complementary to Plato's. Nonetheless, the concordance view is sometimes less easy to accommodate with Aristotle's ethics, unless the ethics are more or less reduced to the apology of contemplative life, which is not my view at all of Aristotle's ethics. Nonetheless, I share with the concordant view the presupposition that Aristotle's agreement with Plato goes much further than it is usually assumed. So my method is to look for close intertextuality between Aristotle's ethics and the Platonic corpus, and to take seriously the nickname of reader, as Plato used to call Aristotle, according to the doxographical tradition. So one obvious divergence between Plato and Aristotle is presumably their respective conception of practical wisdom. At first sight, Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, looks like a war machine against Plato. Indeed, it attempts to distinguish intellectual virtues that Plato treats as equivalent or interchangeable, or even if we don't assume such a polemical purpose, one can simply, as for instance, Bolton in his article puts it, the article I quoted in the bibliography, imagines that Aristotle proceeds according to the spirit of the traditional Platonic method of division. It's page 219. But whatever Aristotle's intention may have been in this book 6, the result amounts to the same. It is openly adversary to Plato regarding especially practical wisdom. Because, so, as Phronesis, Sophia, Episteme, Techne are most of the time used by Plato as substitutable terms, all of them forming what Monique Dixot calls a kind of constellation of knowledge terms, and Aristotle reacts on by dividing cautelosly what is confounded in Plato's works, assigning to each term a specific operation and a specific object, mapping the precise territory of each intellectual virtue. Beyond this obvious opposition to his master, I tried to show in my PhD that Aristotle takes over quite precisely an aporia going back to Plato's Meno concerning phronesis and virtue. So in that perspective, Aristotelian phronesis could be conceived as an attempt to reconcile two aborted solutions to the question of virtue and phronesis in the last part of the Meno. So that's part of this result I will summarize here and then present something new. So that will be the second part of my talk. So I start with the summarizing of this result, but it's important for what follows. So the final section of the Meno, page 8600, begins with the assimilation of virtue to phronesis. This attempt at reduction is part of a hypothetical argument. It remains problematic, this argument, concerning the question whether virtue as a whole or only partly is phronesis, and most of all, it ends up challenged by Socrates, because Socrates objects the want of masters able to teach virtue. The last part of the dialogue, the Meno, investigates the value of the alternative solution suggested by Socrates, namely that right belief might be a successful guide for action. Right belief, being a key for acting successfully, could be virtue, and explains then the kind of ability politicians possess. Although right belief shouldn't be disregarded as merely ironic, I take it, it clearly does not meet the requirements of genuine virtue. The promotion of orthodoxa, right belief, remains highly ambiguous in order, perhaps, to invite Plato's reader to carry on looking for genuine knowledge. Aristotle's concept of phronesis, in my view, gains at being conceived as an attempt to bridge the gap between the characteristics of phronesis in its relationship to virtue and some of the properties of right belief, orthodoxa, as a successful guide for action. And Aristotle proves able to answer the question whether virtuous people do exist. In the Meno, although Pericles and others are qualified in the end as people inspired by divine inspiration, by the Theia Moira, it is not enough for Socrates, who keeps looking for a genuine politician, someone who possesses true political science. We know that the philosopher king in the Republic is able to meet such an expectation. The rulers in the Republic will there possess genuine virtue, grounded in genuine knowledge of the good. Aristotle, in contrast with the end of the Meno, does claim that Pericles and other good politicians embody the political excellence that Socrates denied them. Pericles meets all requirements for virtue. His wisdom is focused on action and on public as well as private utility. Each person gathers moral behavior and practical efficiency. According to Socrates, Pericles' failure to teach his virtue to his own children proves that his alleged virtue cannot be any kind of knowledge. Aristotle plainly acknowledges that Pericles, a Phronesis, according to chapter 5 of book 6, did not transmit his excellence. However, this failure doesn't reveal any flaw in Pericles. It rather means that his virtue should be conceived as another kind of knowledge. Phronesis should not be conceived as a science, given that Aristotle shares with Plato the requirement that episteme has to be teachable. The nature and the origin of his knowledge should be distinguished from that of theoretical science. So now Aristotle's account of Phronesis has therefore to answer the question of the origin of this practical wisdom. The Phronesis ability recalls somehow the divine inspiration of politicians at the end of the Meno. But his efficiency does not stem from any divine origin. Aristotle claims that it simply originates in the background of experience, empiria. This is the text 1 of my handout. Nor is practical wisdom concerned only with universals. An understanding for particulars is also required, since it is practical and action is concerned with particulars. This is why some without knowledge, especially those with experience, are more effective in action than those with it. So empiria proves able to account for the specific ability of Pericles and to explain the unteachable character of this ability. But what interested me is that experience seems not only to answer one, but two challenges presented in the Meno. The first aporia concerns virtue, especially political virtue that the sophists claim to teach. But another aporia concerns the possibility not to acquire political knowledge, but to reach knowledge at all. This is the well-known challenge raised by Meno in page 80. And in this challenge, Socrates recognizes a well-known heuristic trick, which he solves with the myth of reminiscence. We know that Aristotle rejects the Meno theory of reminiscence. Instead, he turns to the genesis of knowledge. Knowledge does not come from some mythical past when the immortal soul would have learned everything, but knowledge comes from a natural history of faculties. Indeed, so this natural history of faculties of the soul is laid out in the last chapter of the Posterior Analytics. In this chapter, Aristotle shows that we possess perception from the outset without needing to exercise it to acquire its power, and with the support of memory and through the process of induction, experience, gives us access to the universal, accounting then for the acquisition of knowledge. This is my text 2. When one of the undifferentiated items makes a stand, there is a privative universal in the soul, for although you perceive particulars, perception is of universals, e.g. of man, not of Callias, the man. Next, a stand is made among these items until something partless and universal makes a stand, e.g. such and such an animal makes a stand until animal does. And with animal, a stand is made in the same way. Thus, it is plain that we must get to know the primitives by induction, for this is a way in which perception, that's the part that interests me, instills the universals. My aim is not to provide a detailed account of this well-known and also well-known for its difficulties passage. It's simply to highlight the common solution brought by Aristotle to the problem of the origin of principles of knowledge, as raised and left partly or unsatisfactorily unanswered in the Meno. The indirect answer to the other aporia, the aporia of political virtue, lies also in the Aristotle refuses to reduce the excellence of statesmen to an inspired opinion and suggested to account for the non-demonstrative and non-transferable character of their abilities through experience. Although the experience brought by age and familiarity with human affairs, which makes the superiority of the prudent, may be much more elaborated than the induction immanent to sensible perception, the common solution to both aporiae of the Meno consists in a grasp of something universal through the particular. The critical faculties that distinguish the phronimos in practical matters have all to do with the practon, that is, with the particular. The description of practical intelligence ascending to the universal from the last term in Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics closely reminds the description of the process by which perception starts from a plurality of similar cases to reach the universal notion in posterior analytics, the last chapter of posterior analytics. In both cases, the universal stems from the perception of particulars. This is my text 3. I read just the end. For these last terms are the first principle for achieving the end, since universals are arrived at from particulars. We ought then to have perception of these, and this is intellection. In order to account for the unusual form of knowledge that phronesis is, Aristotle brings it closer to the functioning of the nous, but not without some qualification. He highlights the common feature between the faculty of principle, apprehending the definition and the first term of scientific demonstration, and the phronesis dealing with the last term, which is the practon. Although the terms that both intellectual abilities grasp are at opposite extremes, phronesis and nous, resemble each other by the non-demonstrative character of their operations that distinguishes them both from science and makes them similar to a form of perception. That is my text 4. Phronesis is therefore opposed to intellect, since intellect is concerned with the first terms, of which there is no rational account to be given, while practical wisdom is concerned with the last thing. And this is the object of knowledge. This is not the perception concerned with objects peculiar to any particular sense, but like that with which we perceive that the last mathematical object is a triangle, for it will stop here as well. So the parallel between the ways Aristotle solves the two aporia of the Meno seems to me well grounded. So in this notion of experience, and a number of scholars, Moss in her book, Jessica Moss in her book on Aristotle and the apparent good, Robert Bolton in the paper I just mentioned provides also a convincing analysis of the parallels between the end of posterior analytics and the experience of the phronimos. And Jessica Moss provides particularly a very convincing reconstruction of this practical induction at works in arbitration and in the end in phronesis. So what I intended to highlight in this first moment is how this parallel is precisely anchored in two different difficulties laid out in the Meno, and one difficulty concerning precisely practical wisdom. This hint at the fact that Aristotle read carefully this dialogue. Empiria accounts for the twofold issue of the origins of the principle of knowledge and of the origin of practical wisdom. Now, I would like to turn to another aspect of practical wisdom, how its principles are acquired and how they are grasped when the virtuous agent is acting. This is the second part of my reconstruction of how Aristotle is indebted to Plato in his conception of practical knowledge beyond the massive differences with which I started. So this second part is still tentative, so I apologize for what is still a work in progress, and I am looking forward to your comments. Now, Aristotle's account for practical principle touches to a well-known and still vivid issue in the interpretation of the ethics, what part do reason or intellectual faculties play into the grasp of principles of action, in other words, into the grasp of the end, the telos. This is a long-standing controversy between intellectualist and anti-intellectualist readings, and this controversy concerned what have been labeled the division of labor between mean and ends, and between character, virtue, and phronesis. See the accounts given in Jessica Moore's book or in the paper of Terence Irwin I mentioned in the bibliography. My aim is not at all to pretend to solve the controversy, rather simply to take a step backwards in order to have a look at the possible Platonic background of Aristotle's construction. In that perspective, I would like to examine the way Plato presents education in the Republic and the laws. It is a stage very different from the Meno from which I started. Indeed, now in the Republic and in the laws, as a psychological scheme to account for virtue, this scheme is not exactly the same in the two works. Indeed, the Republic relies on a tripartite structure of the soul, epigenetikon, tumoides, logistikon, whereas the laws is less explicit on that point. Nonetheless, the Athenian distinguishes through the puppet's image at the end of book 1 between the pool of, let's say, non-rational affection and the opposite pool of reasoning, that is, between affective and rational components within the human soul. There is an obvious continuity between Republic Book 2 and 3 and the laws in the conception of the preliminary education, that is, the education that takes place before the human rationality is fully developed. In my opinion, there isn't any significant discrepancy between the first education dispensed to the guardians and the education to virtue prior to the rational stage devised for Magnesian citizens. The aim of this preliminary education is the same, to habituate the non-rational part in order to prepare the coming to be of the Logos. What I am interested in is twofold. First, the depiction of this education once the Logos has come, that is the fact that it is described as a recognition process, and that this recognition goes with an affective side. Second, the depiction of full virtue as agreement or harmony between affections and reasons, a description that holds equally for the Republic, the laws, but also for Aristotle's ethics. So let us start with the first point. The beginning of book 2 sketches the nature of the guardian and draws attention to his philosophical nature. This is page 376 AB. In its first stage, this love of knowledge that is expressed in the watchdog, analogous to the future guardian, goes simply with an affective reaction to the person close to him, whose unique quality is to be known by him. So the relation of familiarity accounts for the gentle reaction of the watchdog. In pages 375, 376, Plato uses a whole lexicon designating several kinds of close relation, the member of the oikos, oikeioi, synetes, knorimoi, and this later term, gnorimos, is, in my opinion, purposefully ambiguous. Indeed, its meaning conveys not only acquaintance in the sense of familiarity relation, but also in the sense of knowledge. Socrates brings out the link between the guardian's affective reactions and his congenial love of knowledge by pointing out that the affective reaction of the philosophical dog is not due to any bad or good treatment. It is not a reaction to some useful or harmful experience, rather to the familiarity, that is, to the fact of knowing the person or not. All this lexicon of family relationship is to be kept in mind for what follows. Likewise, Plato uses in this line about the watchdog the verb aspazo, which is quite a strong term to describe an affection, and a term often used by Plato in love relationships. And above all, this term will come up again in our next passage, devoted to the aim of moral education through music and associated with knowledge or familiarity. This is my text 5 from book 3. And so, since he feels discussed correctly, he will praise fine things, be pleased by them, take them into his soul, and through being nourished by them, become fine and good. What is ugly or shameful, on the other hand, he will correctly condemn and hate while he is still young, before he is able to grasp the reason. And because he has been so trained, he will welcome the reason when it comes and recognize it easily because of its kinship with himself. This education is being pervaded with beauty, and its aim is to make sensitive to every manifestation of beauty. Let us remember that the acuity of perception, this time in the strictly physiological sense of the term, was precisely one quality the watchdog is supposed to be endowed with in Book 2. From the perception of beauty stems pleasure or displeasure in the contrary case. This gives rise to a twofold reaction. A reflective reaction through some kind of judgment, praise, and blame. Indeed, the kalon arouses admiration, it implies a recognition of some positive value, and therefore it calls for praise, and its opposite, the ugly, calls for blame. And this gives also rise to an affective reaction, love or hate, expressed by an impulse towards the welcoming or a rejection of the object qualified as fine or ugly. Recognition of the fine occurs thanks to the very nature of the beautiful that enables such a continuity between aesthetic values and moral values. That's more or less the same beauty that is perceived through different media. There is no equivocation, rather two instantiations of one and the same property, for which forms you ultimately account in the Republic. The recognition and the capacity of perception cultivated by musical education are compared just after our passage to the recognition of the letters of the alphabet by the one who can read. Such a recognition is of a perceptive kind, and I will come back to that point later. It is what follows in my text. So I just read the last line. Then by the gods, aren't I right in saying that neither we nor the guardians we claim to be educating will be musically trained until we know the different forms of temperance, courage, generosity, high-mindedness, and all their kindred and their opposites too, which are carried around all over the place, and see them in the things in which they are, both themselves and their images. These lines are a matter of controversy due to the term eidos, whether it implies intelligible forms or the more common meaning of species. I won't enter this debate, but I just assume that musical education allows the guardians to recognize the sensitive images of the virtue, to perceive their common character, and to identify them in various supports. So this musical education develops their moral perception. The use of the lexicon of oikeion via the noun oikeiotes in this musical education highlights the two elements previously identified in the description of the philosopher nature. The affective component, philia for what is related, based on a familiarity, the fact of knowing. Joshua Wilburn, in his book, in the bibliography, has underlined that the language of my text strictly echoes the description of the dog's nature. He also points out the conjunction of two affective phenomena identified by Plato. On the one hand, the affection for what is oikeion, close or one's own. It is the philia component. On is perceived as beautiful. that it precisely the virtue of imitation that Plato intends to exploit in education. With the development of reason, the recognition of the moral values draws on this background of familiarity. Consequently, such recognition involves affection and generates a desire for assimilating. These two reactions, affection and assimilation, leads to the final agreement constitutive of virtue. Indeed, Socrates does not only describe the effect of first musical education as affection, but also as agreement, symphonia. This symphonia is based on the experience of recognition and perception of kinship. The recognition concerns the content of logos, what reason prescribes. This conception of completed education as agreement is quite literally taken, and also as recognition is quite literally taken over in Book 2 of the Laws. That's my text 8. When we are children, the first sensations we experience are pleasure and pain, and it is in our pleasures and pains that virtue and vice first develop in our souls. By the time we are old, we are lucky if we have so developed wisdom and stable true opinions, for this good and all that they involve complete a person. But it is the virtue that first develops in children that I am calling education. If pleasure and liking and pain and hatred develop correctly in our souls when we are not yet able to grasp the account, and when we do grasp the account, they agree with it because they have been correctly trained by appropriate habits. This agreement is virtue in its entirety. So in the law, the first education is external to logos, entirely located in the sensibility. Reason comes afterwards, when it comes as wisdom or as true opinion. And similarly to the account of the Republic, education ends with the agreement with reason. So this final agreement between reason and affection is the result that the education of sensibility was supposed to get in the Republic. In both accounts, the agreement is experienced by the soul as a form of recognition founded on a familiarity previously cultivated by perceptive and affective means. Now I come to Aristotle. It has long been recognized that Aristotle's ethics is somehow deeply indebted to Plato's conception of education through pain and pleasure. All the more that Aristotle himself admits his debt and pays tribute to Plato in one of the rare positive evaluation of his master. See Book 2 of Nicomachean Ethics, Chapter 3. There are striking similarities between several Aristotelian statesmen and what we have just seen in the Republic and in the laws. In Book 10, for instance, the following sentence echoes strictly Republic 3 concerning pre-existing affective feelings towards the fines. It's my text 6. Argument and teaching, presumably, are not powerful in every case, but the soul of the students must be prepared beforehand in its habits with a view to its enjoying and aiding in a noble way, like soil that is to nourish seed. There must, therefore, somehow be a pre-existing character with some affinity for virtue through its fondness for what is noble and dislike for what is disgraceful. The concrete devices for preparing the soul before rationality are to be found in the last book of the Politics, where the short sketch of musical education takes over much of Plato's teaching. That's my text 7. Since then, music is a pleasure and virtue consists in rejoicing and loving and hating aright, there is clearly nothing which we are so much concerned to acquire and to cultivate as the power of forming right judgments and of taking delight in good disposition and noble actions. Aristotle himself refers back to Plato concerning music in Politic, Book 8, Chapter 7. Beyond the concrete pedagogical devices that Aristotle has in mind, the purpose of moral education is also strictly parallel. We can easily draw close parallels between the Platonic conception of the morality educated person, in whom non-rational affections harmonize with reason, and the depiction of the desiring part of the soul obeying to reason in Aristotle's Moral Psychology of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. This is my text 9. The element in the soul, in the self-controlled person, at least obeys reason, and presumably in the temperate and the brave person, it is still more ready to listen, since in their case it is in total harmony with reason. And also text 10, the portrait of the temperate man. So the appetitive element in a temperate person, the aim of both is what is noble, and the temperate person's appetite is for the right thing in the right way and at the right time. And this is what reason requires as well. All these passages show the extent to which Aristotle agrees with Plato in his depiction of virtue as a state of harmony or agreement between non-rational elements and rational components. Here, there might be another common point with Plato's text. We have seen that the recognition of the values one rationally grasps is accompanied with affective reaction. In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 13, virtue is described as the desiderative part of the soul obeying to reason, as if one were listening to one's father or one's friends. And Bolton, in his paper, points out rightly that the obedience to father or friends shouldn't be understood as mere submission to authority. It implies trust and love, cognitive acceptance of what is prescribed, and, I quote him, genuine love for it. It seems to me precisely the kind of affective reaction highlighted by Plato in my text of Book 3. But the fact that reason prescribes that it expresses the value to be pursued or the rules that should guide our conduct does not imply that the principle reason states come from itself. Rather, the opposite view holds for Aristotle, claiming unambiguously that the principles are given by habituation. That habituation is a way of acquiring principle is stated clearly in two passages from the some by perfection, some by a kind of habituation. And in case we might doubt that the principles seen by habituation are the practical principle, another text confirms it later, claiming that principles are given through virtue, natural or acquired by habituation. This is my text 13. I read just the end. Rather, it is virtue, either natural or habituated, that enable us to think correctly about the first principle. This part of the story is perfectly in line with the description of preliminary education preparing the grasping by the Logos in Republic 3 or in the Laws. But Plato remains silent in the passages we read before about the origins of the values transmitted through musical education. In the Republic, one may assume that knowledge in the philosopher's king can be the source of the values, given that philosophers who design the preliminary education do have rational knowledge of the principle, since such principles are ultimately the form of the good, of the fine, of the just. Therefore, habituation, education of non-rational part in the Republic can be guided by the Logos it has to rejoin. Plato's theory is able to maintain a logical priority of the Logos, even though it is chronologically posterior in the psychological process of moral training. The affective side of recognition warrants that the agent desires and loves what reason prescribes. Affections recognize the Logos that is given first from outside, through right belief, for instance. But now, what might seem not so problematic in Plato's accounts of moral education turns out more problematic for Aristotle's scheme. Indeed, as is well known, Aristotle insists that the end of the action, that for the sake of which, is not given by reason or intellectual excellence, even action-oriented as Phronesis is, but by character virtue, that is, by a desiderative state. This gives rise to the well-known means-ends puzzle concerning the division of labor of virtue and phronesis I alluded to before. Do the ends really come from virtue, or does reason play a part in determining them? I come now to the many passages reflecting on the status of principle in practical thinking. They claim that the ends play the role of hypotheses in practical reasoning, so that they cannot be established by reason. Rather, they have to be assumed for deliberation to come about. Book 2 of Eudemian Ethic contains the clearest formulation of this basic tenet of Aristotle ethics. That is my text 14. I will read just the beginning. Just as in theoretical sciences, the postulates are starting points, so in the productive sciences, the end is a starting point and a postulate. Given that so and so needs to be healthy, such and such must abstain, if that is to be the case, just as in the theoretical realm, given that the triangle is equivalent to two right angles, then such and such must be the case. In theoretical sciences, the first principles are assumed without being demonstrated. They are given either by perception or admitted as hypotheses. See my text of Metaphysics, Epsilon 1. I won't read it because I am quite late, I realize. In practical sciences, likewise, ends are not determined by reasoning, the central form of which is deliberation, but they are posited as starting point for reasoning. These ends are given by character virtue, and therefore the principle of action, the right end to be pursued, cannot appear anymore to a vicious character. This is my text 16 and 17. I will just read the second one. As we have said, so the 17, as we have said, and as is clear, virtue is involved on this eyes of the soul's reaching its developed state. For practical syllogism have a first principle, since such and such is the end of chief good, whatever it is. Let it be anything you like for the sake of argument. And this is evident to the good person alone, since wickedness distorts our vision and thoroughly deceives us about the first principles of actions. Also given by desire, these ends in practical thinking take the form of judgments. Indeed, they are labeled in the text describing the operations of practical thinking as hypolepses. This is my text, so see my text 16 and 18, I quote this one. If then it is characteristic of practically wise people to have deliberated well, good deliberation will be correctness with regard to what is useful toward the end or some end. There is a textual problem here, but it doesn't matter for my purpose, about which practical wisdom is true supposition, aletes hypolepsis. As Jessica Moss points out in her book, the fact that practical reason makes a deduction necessarily implies that the starting point of the reasoning has to be discursively expressed as a statement, as the recurrent examples of Aristotle show. The various descriptions of the acratic or the continent person confirm that point. It is either expressed as reason, the uncontrolled person is such to act in accordance with appetite and against reasoning, see Eudemian Ethics, Book 2, Chapter 7, or as wish, boulesis, namely a species of desire. But wish is equivalent to a belief concerning the best thing to do. See my text 19. In contrast, one wishes for is above all the end, and one believes that one should be healthy or farewell. As the psychological treatises make it clear, the object of desire must indeed be given through a cognitive act. It is thought or imagined in the De Anima, Book 3, Chapter 10. To the non-virtuous people, the right principle of practical reasoning are not provided by the deliberative part. They do not appear, for such an appearance as a judgment about the goal to be pursued implies the adequate training of desire. Therefore, Aristotle can maintain that virtue as a desiderative state is responsible for providing the principle of practical reasoning, that is the end, and that this principle can take the form of a doxa, an hypolepsis, that builds the starting point of this practical thinking. Let's go back to my text 13 and the end. Rather, it is virtue, either natural or habituated, that enable us to think correctly, to orthodoxein about the first principle. So the origin of the principle is clearly assigned to something external to reason. Given this assumption concerning the principle, I finally come to the last part and the most tentative one of my argument. Let us go back to some passages describing the operation of practical reasoning as kind of recognition, and let us compare this recognition and passages that compares it recognition to the grasp of the principle by nous. That were my text 3 and 4. Earlier, I have briefly drawn attention to this text because there were some of the pieces that allow me to make a parallel between Aristotle's common response to the two challenges raised in the Meno. Now, I would like to draw attention to another Platonic echo in these lines, although this echo might be less obvious. This echo concerns the kind of perception that is at stake. This special kind of perception is at the same time an act of recognition, and such recognition relies on an affective background. According to me, the process at work is quite similar to the final stage of moral education at Book 3 of the Republic, when the Logos has come and the agent is able to recognize in the description of reason what he has already made one's own through non-rational feelings correctly oriented. I am struck by the fact that the passage from Republic 3 ends with an analogy with the reading process. That is the faculty of recognizing letters under several forms. This is in fact an image that Plato frequently uses in the Theaetetus or in the Politicus. But let me just quote the parts of my text file that I skipped before. It is like learning to read. We became adequately proficient only when the few letters that there are did not escape us, melantanoi, in any of the different words in which they are scattered about. And when we did not disregard them, either in small word or a great one, they were not worth noticing, but we tried hard to distinguish, diagnoskein them wherever they occur, knowing that we should not be competent reader until we knew our letters. And just the end of this passage, until we know, gnorizomen, the different form of temperance, courage, generosity, high-mindedness, and all their kindred, which are carried around all over the place, and see them in the thing in which they are. Aistanometa, both themselves and their images. The reading ability is a kind of recognition process. Admittedly, the comparison with reading is not used by Aristotle to describe the process by which the perception of particular goes back to the principle it exemplifies in the ethics. Nonetheless, I am tempted to push the parallel between the recognition of the principle through the particular and this reading process for the following reason. Michel Crubelier, in his paper from 2004, pointed out that the special kind of perception at stake in acting, when the particular perceived in situation traces back to the universal, the end, is described by Aristotle through two kinds of non-standard experiences of perception that correspond to the experience of practical wisdom when grasping a particular. One example is the one Aristotle uses in the Ethic, is the perception of a triangle. That's my text 4. This experience is close to that of perception, although it's not strictly speaking perception. And the other example Aristotle takes to describe this non-standard experience of perception, although not used in the Ethic, is that of reading. Reading is indeed a model Aristotle favors for describing the specific operation that mixes perception with intellection. I quote Michel Crubelier about the grasp of the practon. Thus, knowledge of the practon, it's in French, but it's not translated in English. Thus, knowledge of the practon can be described both as a form of intellection and as a case of perception. It is perception because it deals with singular and contingent objects, but at the same time, it involves the grasping of something that is not a sensible datum, and that must be understood. It can be considered, to recall a favorite example of Aristotle, as a case of reading. The practice of reading and writing consists in recognizing in the singular figure that I have before my eyes, this A, an example of a universal type, an A. This way of conceptualizing the practical recognition at works when Phronesis grasps a practon and goes back to the universal type may echo Plato's own image of the recognition of the letter in the capacity of reading. This echo seems to me not superficial or casual. Practical wisdom implies such a capacity to discern what is to be done in a given particular situation by grasping the particular and recognizing it as an instance of the end. Although both Plato and Aristotle remain silent about the detailed account of arbitration preparing the soul to the agreement with reason that virtue is, Aristotle might have retained something of the depiction of the process sketched in Book 3 of the Republic. Empiria forms then the both intellectual and desiderative background that enables such a recognition in Aristotle. Recognition of the values in Plato's languages, that is, of the end as principle of practical thinking in Aristotle's languages, is ultimately a matter of perception, a non-standard perception that originates as the formation of concept in the genesis of the human mind laid out at the ends of the posterior analytics in the cognitive or discriminative faculty of the soul that perception is. Of course, I am aware that these echoes between Book 3 and the Republic and Aristotle's ethics should not hide the differences. In Plato, the relation copy model still governs the analogy of reading. It deals with discerning the fine in every context, from the imitation to the action and intimately to the knowledge of the forms. Besides, the twofold aspect of the fine allows for a strong continuity between aesthetic responses and moral responses that is less easy to reconstruct in Aristotle. So without putting too much weight on this single page of the Republic, I tried to show that it incites to take seriously the Platonic legacy concerning arbitration in order to instill the right principle of practical knowledge and is able to grasp the principle in practical thinking. To conclude, finally, my purpose was to show that it was worth taking Aristotle, if not as a Platonist, at least as a careful reader of Plato, on one subject in which the discrepancy between both seems huge at first sight. A closer look at Aristotle's construal reveals his attention to the aporia raised in the Meno. It reveals also that he retained from the Republic and the laws not only the concrete pedagogical devices that he takes over in the last book of the Politics, but also a more significant stance on how moral education leads to the recognition of the principle of virtuous action. Thank you very much for your patience.